We've all heard the stories whispered through history about kings and queens who supposedly lost their grip on reality. They've been remembered as unstable, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. Think of the fiery outbursts of Ivan the Terrible, the glass delusions of Charles VI of France, or the notorious excesses of Emperor Caligula. Their reputations have been passed down for centuries, often reduced to one word: mad. But what if that label is far too simple, even misleading? What if their so-called madness was not pure delusion, but sometimes strategy, sometimes illness, and sometimes a convenient story spun by those who wanted them out of the way? Take King George III. For generations, he was portrayed as a monarch unfit to rule, remembered only for the loss of the American colonies and his tragic descent into mental illness. Yet modern research suggests his episodes were far more complicated than the caricature implies. Or consider Joanna of Castile, long called Joanna the Mad. Was she truly insane, or was her grief and independence deliberately exaggerated to justify stripping her of power? Even Caligula, remembered as one of the most infamous rulers of Rome, may have been the victim of hostile sources that wanted to discredit his reign. The truth is, history's mad monarchs were far more than their outbursts, breakdowns, or strange behaviors. They were people trapped in impossible positions, carrying the crushing weight of power, struggling against political enemies, personal tragedy, and sometimes real illness. Their stories are not just tales of madness, but windows into the way history has been written, remembered, and distorted. And by peeling back the myths, we uncover a far more human, and often far more fascinating, truth. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we are diving deep into the world of history's so-called mad monarchs to uncover the hidden realities behind their legends. We've all heard the tales of kings and emperors who seem to lose their grip on reality, their names passed down in history as cautionary examples of rulers consumed by madness. Their eccentricities are retold as spectacle, their reputations boiled down to stories of instability and chaos. Yet when we look closer, the question emerges: were these rulers truly lost to mental illness, or were they misunderstood, misrepresented, or even deliberately maligned by rivals who stood to gain from portraying them as unfit? The truth is never simple. Kingship has always been a stage, and those who wore the crown lived under pressures few of us can imagine. To rule was not only to wield power, but to constantly defend legitimacy, to maintain favor among courtiers, and to navigate the shifting expectations of the public. Madness, whether real or alleged, could become both a weapon and a shield. One striking example is Christian VII of Denmark. Born in the mid-18th century, he inherited the throne as a young man, but soon became infamous for his erratic behavior. Accounts describe him as eccentric, prone to sudden outbursts, and incapable of serious leadership. He was said to wander the streets, strike down courtiers in fits of temper, and indulge in odd and sometimes shocking habits. To his contemporaries, he was quickly dismissed as incapable, an embarrassment to the monarchy. But was he truly incapacitated, or was something else at play? Some historians have suggested that Christian's strangeness may not have been pure illness. In a court filled with intrigue, where any sign of weakness could draw predators, exaggerating or leaning into the image of the fool may have been a way of surviving without becoming the target of lethal rivalries. Others argue that his peculiarities were real, but magnified and exploited by those around him, especially his court physicians and advisors, who used his supposed madness to seize control of the government. Christian's case highlights a broader theme: the dangerous intersection of power, politics, and perception. A king's reputation was never solely his own to control. It was filtered through pamphlets, letters, foreign ambassadors, and later historians. Once the label of madness stuck, it became nearly impossible to peel away. This dynamic can be seen in the stories of other so-called mad monarchs, like George III of Britain. His reign coincided with some of the most turbulent years in British history, not least the loss of the American colonies. As his health declined, he suffered what were described as uncontrollable fits, wild speech, and erratic conduct. These episodes have often been used to depict him as hopelessly deranged, the king who lost America because he lost his mind. Yet modern medical analysis suggests his behavior may have been linked to a physical illness, such as porphyria, which can cause severe pain, hallucinations, and disorientation. What contemporaries read as madness may instead have been the visible suffering of a man trapped in his own failing body. This blending of medical mystery and political storytelling is not unique to George III. Consider Ivan IV of Russia, known to posterity as Ivan the Terrible. His reign was marked by episodes of horrific violence, including the creation of the Oprichnina, a personal guard that carried out brutal campaigns of terror. He murdered nobles, terrorized towns, and even killed his own son in a fit of rage. To many, these acts make him the very image of a mad tyrant. Yet his reign also oversaw the expansion of Russian territory on an unprecedented scale, consolidating a state that would endure long after his death. Here lies the paradox. Can a man responsible for such cruelty also be credited as a shaper of his nation's future? Was his violence the product of ungovernable impulses, or a calculated, if ruthless, strategy to secure power in a fractured and dangerous land? In Rome, the figure of Caligula offers another infamous case. Stories of his depravity and excess are legendary. Parading himself as a god, indulging in grotesque pleasures, executing rivals without cause. Ancient sources portray him as unhinged, a man whose reign was a carnival of insanity. But those same sources were written by senators and historians with their own grievances against the imperial system. For them, depicting Caligula as a monster reinforced their arguments about the dangers of concentrated power. The line between truth and propaganda is thin, and we cannot dismiss the possibility that his reputation has been shaped as much by his enemies as by his own actions. Caligula may have been cruel, erratic, and arrogant, but whether he was truly mad in a clinical sense is far from certain. The question then becomes, what does it mean to call a monarch mad? The language of madness has always been slippery. In some cases, it described genuine symptoms of mental or physical illness. In others, it was a label wielded by rivals to delegitimize a ruler. Sometimes it was both at once, a genuine illness exaggerated and manipulated for political ends. To understand these monarchs, we need to move beyond simple labels and examine the pressures they faced. A king was never merely a private person. He was a symbol, a target, and often a prisoner of his own court. His every word and gesture could be weaponized by those around him. This becomes especially clear when we look at the way monarchs' supposed madness was used to alter the balance of power. In Britain, George III's illness led to debates over the regency, shifting authority to his son and reshaping the politics of the late 18th century. In Denmark, Christian VII's incapacity allowed his physician Johann Struensee to rise to unprecedented influence, pushing through reforms until he was overthrown. In Russia, Ivan's terrifying outbursts justified his ruthless campaigns against the nobility, consolidating his grip on the throne. In Rome, Caligula's enemies used tales of his excesses to rally opposition and justify his assassination. In every case, the story of madness served a political function. It is also worth noting that the cultural expectations of the time shaped how madness was perceived. In the 18th century, rationality and self-control were celebrated as hallmarks of enlightened leadership. A king who failed to embody these ideals could easily be cast as unfit. In earlier centuries, displays of fury or unpredictability might be tolerated, even admired, as signs of divine inspiration or strength. What we read as madness today may have been interpreted differently in its own time, depending on the cultural values at play. This reminds us that we must be cautious about projecting modern understandings of mental health backward into history. Diagnosing figures like George III or Christian VII from a distance is tempting, but it risks oversimplifying their experiences. At the same time, we should resist taking hostile accounts at face value. The truth lies somewhere in between, shaped by illness, politics, culture, and the personal struggles of men who happen to sit on thrones. What emerges from these stories is a picture of monarchy that is far more complex than the caricatures suggest. These rulers were not simply mad or sane, heroes or villains. They were human beings caught in extraordinary circumstances, their lives magnified and distorted by the lenses of power and history. Madness, whether genuine or alleged, became part of their legacy, but it was never the whole story. To move beyond the asylum walls of historical imagination, we must peel back the layers of myth and propaganda. We must ask who benefited from portraying a king as insane, what cultural assumptions shaped the judgment, and what personal struggles might have been at the heart of the story. Only then can we begin to see these monarchs not as caricatures of madness, but as complex figures navigating the impossible burdens of rule. Their stories challenge us to reconsider how we think about power, illness, and the fragile line between performance and reality. A king's madness may have been a tragedy, a tactic, or a tale spun by his enemies. But in every case, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that leadership has always been as much about perception as it is about reality. And in that sense, the so-called mad monarchs have much to teach us about the human cost of power, long after their reigns have ended. The line between madness and strategy has always been thin, especially when it comes to kings and emperors who lived in courts where every gesture was scrutinized and every mistake could be fatal. Building on the idea of monarchs unfairly branded as insane, we can now explore something even more intriguing. Rulers who may have chosen to appear unstable on purpose, or whose supposed instability was exaggerated by those with something to gain. In the royal Game of Thrones, madness itself could be wielded as a tool of power. A king who seemed unpredictable could keep enemies on edge. A ruler who presented himself as unbalanced could disarm rivals. And one who was rumored to be incapable might allow trusted advisors to act in his name while he avoided personal blame for unpopular decisions. At the same time, the medical knowledge of earlier centuries was too limited to distinguish between genuine illness and misunderstood symptoms, and the language of insanity was ripe for political exploitation. Consider the possibility of strategic madness. Monarchs often lived under the constant threat of assassination or usurpation. In such dangerous environments, feigning instability could serve as protection. If a ruler appeared too erratic to plot against effectively, potential challengers might hesitate, unsure of how he would react. At times, unpredictability could even become a form of deterrence. Ivan IV of Russia, for example, while genuinely prone to violent outbursts, also understood the power of fear. His terrifying persona became a political weapon. Nobles never knew when his temper would explode, so they treaded carefully. Was every act of cruelty an uncontrollable fit, or were some of them calculated performances meant to secure obedience? The ambiguity itself became a shield. In other cases, rulers may have allowed rumors of madness to circulate because it gave them plausible deniability. If a controversial decision led to unrest, the court could whisper that the king was not in his right mind, and blame shifted away from deliberate policy. This blurring of responsibility often served monarchs well in times of crisis. Even more fascinating is the idea that some kings leaned into their eccentric reputations as a way of escaping the unbearable pressures of leadership. To play the fool was, in a sense, to escape accountability while still keeping the throne. Christian VII of Denmark may embody this idea most clearly. His erratic behavior created a vacuum that allowed others, especially his physician Struensee, to govern in his stead. Whether Christian exaggerated his instability to retreat from responsibility, or whether his symptoms were real and manipulated by those around him, the result was the same. Madness became a mask behind which power was rearranged. At the same time, we must confront how fragile the concept of madness was in a world without modern medicine. Symptoms we now understand as signs of physical illnesses were once interpreted as signs of insanity. Tremors, hallucinations, changes in speech, or uncontrollable fits could all be misread through the lens of moral weakness or divine punishment. A king suffering from a metabolic condition, neurological disorder, or even exhaustion might easily be labeled unfit to rule. The tragedy was that these misunderstandings were often weaponized. Enemies of a ruler would not hesitate to highlight and exaggerate his symptoms to delegitimize him. Allies might also emphasize madness if it suited them, especially if it allowed them to seize power in his name. In such contexts, the truth was almost impossible to separate from the layers of political convenience. King George III of Britain offers perhaps the clearest example of this dynamic. His reign spanned one of the most transformative periods in British history, including the loss of the American colonies and the early rumblings of industrial change. From his youth, George was known as earnest and conscientious, deeply devoted to duty. Yet as the pressures of rule mounted, his health began to decline. He suffered episodes that baffled his doctors and terrified his court. His speech would race, his temper grew uncontrollable, and his behavior at times seemed wildly inappropriate for a monarch. Contemporaries interpreted these symptoms as madness, and he was mocked in pamphlets, whispered about in salons, and increasingly seen as incapable of sound judgment. But modern medical researchers have raised another possibility. George's symptoms may have been linked to porphyria, a genetic disorder affecting the body's ability to process certain chemicals, which can lead to severe pain, hallucinations, discolored urine, and mental confusion. Others suggest he may have suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by swings between manic and depressive states. What is striking is how little his contemporaries understood of these conditions. To them, he was not suffering from illness, but was losing his mind. In a society that prized rationality and self-control, a king who appeared erratic could not inspire confidence. The political consequences were profound. George's illness came to the fore during and after the American Revolution, when Britain's defeat raised questions about the competence of its leaders. Was the king's madness to blame for losing the colonies? This narrative suited many critics, who were eager to pin the failure on a monarch rather than on the structural challenges of governing an empire stretched across the ocean. To blame madness was convenient, a simple story that absolved others of responsibility. Yet when we examine the evidence more closely, it becomes clear that George remained engaged in governance for much of the conflict, reading reports, consulting ministers, and making decisions. His illness, though real and debilitating at times, did not fully incapacitate him during the crucial years of the war. To reduce the loss of America to the madness of one man is to distort the complexity of the situation, turning geopolitical realities into a morality tale about an unstable king. The Regency debates that followed George's later episodes further reveal the interplay between medical misunderstanding and political expediency. As his health deteriorated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, his son, the Prince of Wales, stood to benefit from a formal declaration of incapacity. Politicians on both sides used the king's condition to push their agendas, some demanding the prince take over, others resisting out of loyalty or fear of change. In this way, the king's illness became not just a personal tragedy, but a stage for political theater. His body and mind were no longer his own. They were contested territory. The case of George III also illustrates the deep human cost of being labeled mad. Once the word attached to him, it colored every perception of his reign. His earnest efforts to live a moral life, his devotion to agriculture and science, his sincere commitment to his role, were all overshadowed by the image of the mad king. Madness, whether genuine or not, became the headline of his story, flattening his humanity into caricature. And yet, behind the walls of Windsor Castle where he spent his final years, George lived in seclusion, blind and nearly deaf, cut off from the world. His supposed madness had become both the explanation for his failures and the justification for his removal from public life. Looking across history, George's fate is not unique. Again and again, monarchs have been trapped by the dual forces of misunderstanding and manipulation. The label of madness was rarely neutral. It was a weapon, a tool, a convenient story to explain away uncomfortable realities. Sometimes it was rooted in genuine illness, but even then it was shaped and magnified by the agendas of those around them. When we revisit these stories with fresh eyes, we begin to see the pattern. Strategic madness could be a performance, a shield, or a mask. Misdiagnosed illness could become the foundation for political maneuvering. And in both cases, the ruler himself became less a man than a symbol onto which others projected their fears and ambitions. Madness in monarchy was never just about the private suffering of one individual. It was about power, perception, and the fragile balance that held empires together. The deeper we go into these tales, the clearer it becomes that the so-called mad monarchs were not simply victims of their own minds. They were participants in a larger game, whether willingly or not, in which madness itself became part of the arsenal of rule. Their stories remind us that power has always been as much about appearance as about substance, and that the line between strategy and instability, between illness and propaganda, has always been blurred. The story of kings and queens whose lives have been marked by whispers of madness cannot be separated from the crushing weight of monarchy itself. Beyond questions of strategy and the political usefulness of instability lies the human toll of absolute power. To sit upon a throne was to exist inside a pressure cooker, a place where every glance was measured, every word was recorded, and every decision could shape the fate of millions. The isolation that came with such power was profound. A monarch might be surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and attendants at every hour of the day, yet in truth he or she was utterly alone. Trust was a rare and fragile thing, because every companion might be a rival in disguise, every family member a potential usurper, every servant a spy for some faction. Imagine the psychic strain of living like that, year after year, with no respite and no privacy. This sense of perpetual scrutiny was magnified by the rigid demands of dynastic succession. A ruler's body was never fully their own, but rather the vessel of a dynasty's survival. The pressure to produce heirs, to maintain an unbroken line of succession, and to embody the strength of a kingdom weighed heavily on men and women alike. For women especially, the expectation to bear children and the dangers of childbirth could break both body and spirit. For men, the constant fear of rebellion, assassination, and betrayal could corrode trust and leave them suspicious, paranoid, or withdrawn. In this atmosphere, it is no wonder that many monarchs began to show signs of strain that contemporaries quickly labeled as madness. Yet what was often dismissed as instability might have been nothing more than the visible cracks of a human being asked to bear more than any one person could reasonably endure. The problem was not only psychological, but also biological. For centuries, royal families across Europe and beyond practiced intermarriage to preserve dynastic ties, wealth, and power. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and the same small pool of noble families supplied brides and grooms for generation after generation. This inbreeding had consequences, some visible in the form of physical deformities, others hidden in the form of inherited illnesses. Conditions that today we would recognize as genetic disorders were in the past interpreted through the lens of character, morality, or divine judgment. A king born with frail health or sudden fits of temper might be seen as cursed, unstable, or even mad, when in reality he was suffering the inescapable consequences of centuries of narrowed bloodlines. The Habsburg dynasty is perhaps the most famous example of this. Their relentless intermarriage eventually produced rulers whose jaws protruded so far that they could barely chew their food, a deformity now known as the Habsburg jaw. But beyond the visible, there were likely hidden hereditary conditions that affected mental health as well. Weakness of the mind, sudden mood swings, or difficulty with judgment could just as easily have been passed down as a crooked jawline. When these traits appeared in rulers, they were magnified by the pressures of power and quickly became the stuff of legend. Madness was not always a mysterious curse or divine punishment. It was often the byproduct of biology compounded by an impossible role. Few stories illustrate this mixture of psychological strain, hereditary burden, and political manipulation better than that of Joanna of Castile, remembered to history as Joanna the Mad-Born at the turn of the 16th century. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who completed the Reconquista and sent Columbus across the Atlantic. From birth, she was a pawn in the grand chessboard of European politics, married off to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy to cement alliances. Her life, like that of many royal women, was never her own. Accounts of Joanna's supposed madness began early and were shaped by grief, jealousy, and manipulation. When her beloved husband Philip died unexpectedly in his 20s, Joanna's reaction was profound and unsettling to those around her. She refused to part with his body, reportedly traveling with his coffin, opening it to gaze upon him, and resisting all efforts to move on. To contemporaries, this behavior was evidence of madness. To us, it looks more like the raw pain of a young woman overwhelmed by grief, compounded by isolation and suspicion. But Joanna's story was further twisted by the ambitions of those closest to her. Her father Ferdinand, eager to maintain control over Castile, and later her son Charles, who would become Holy Roman Emperor, both had strong motives to portray her as incapable of rule. Declaring Joanna insane allowed them to seize her authority and confine her to a life of seclusion. In this sense, her madness was at least partly a political construct. Was she grieving, perhaps suffering from depression or another condition, or was she deliberately undermined by those who found her inconvenient? The truth is likely a blend of all three. She may well have had a predisposition to mental strain, heightened by her family's genetic inheritance. Her grief at Philip's death was genuine and consuming. Yet her confinement and the enduring label of madness served political ends far more than personal ones. What makes Joanna's story so haunting is how it embodies the larger theme of monarchy's human cost. She was a woman stripped of agency, her private sorrow turned into a weapon against her, her name forever marked by a word that may or may not have been accurate. To call her the Mad is to ignore the pressures of dynastic politics, the weight of her heritage, and the ruthless ambitions of her father and son. Madness became a convenient shorthand, but behind it was a complex, suffering human being. If we place Joanna alongside other monarchs branded with similar labels, a pattern emerges. Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, suffered from episodes where he believed he was made of glass or forgot his own name. His condition may have been genuine psychosis, but it was intensified by the suffocating atmosphere of court life and the hereditary frailties of French royalty. Maria I of Portugal, another queen later called Mad, descended into deep sorrow and instability after the death of her husband and children, her mental collapse reflecting grief as much as illness. In each case, the title of madness erased the complex interplay of biology, circumstance, and personal tragedy. When we step back, the weight of the crown itself becomes the central thread linking all these stories. Monarchs did not live ordinary lives. They lived in cages made of gold, where the expectations of nations pressed upon their shoulders and the eyes of the world never turned away. Their marriages were not chosen out of love, but arranged for strategy, often binding them to cousins whose blood carried the hidden seeds of disorder. Their griefs were public, their weaknesses magnified, their illnesses judged not as human frailty, but as threats to the stability of the realm. In such a world, to be labeled mad was not only a reflection of one's state of mind, but also a mirror of the unbearable demands placed upon them. The lesson from Joanna and others like her is clear. Madness in monarchy was rarely a single, simple thing. It was born of isolation, pressure, and heredity, but it was also shaped by the ambitions of those who stood to gain. When we strip away the myths and the convenient labels, we begin to see not caricatures of mad kings and queens, but real human beings trying to endure impossible circumstances. They remind us that behind every legend of madness lies a crown that weighed too heavily on the head it adorned. When we look back on the long line of rulers whose reputations have been stained or defined by the word madness, we begin to notice a pattern that reveals far more about politics and power than about personal frailty. The stories of George III, Ivan IV, Christian VII, Caligula, Charles VI of France, Maria I of Portugal, and Joanna of Castile all carry the same echo. Madness, whether genuine or alleged, became an explanation, a tool, and a disguise. Yet if we peel back the layers of exaggeration, propaganda, and centuries of retelling, another truth emerges. The so-called mad monarchs were not simply prisoners of their own minds, but complex individuals navigating a world of crushing demands and lethal rivalries. Their supposedly erratic acts, when re-examined, often reveal deeper motivations, sometimes misguided, sometimes ruthless, but rarely meaningless. What looks like irrationality on the surface may in fact have been the product of desperate attempts to secure stability, to reform institutions, or to leave behind a lasting legacy in circumstances that allowed no easy path forward. Take Ivan IV of Russia again. His reign is remembered for its terrors. The oprichnina, the public executions, the campaigns of cruelty that decimated noble families. His fits of rage and paranoia, culminating in the killing of his own son, have cemented his reputation as a mad tyrant. Yet behind the veil of brutality lay a ruler faced with the enormous task of consolidating a fragile and sprawling realm. Russia at the time was a patchwork of principalities and boyar factions, vulnerable to internal rebellion and external threats. Ivan's policies, however cruel, can be seen as part of an attempt to break the power of the aristocracy and centralize authority under the crown. His violence was excessive, and his paranoia may well have been genuine, but his actions had a strategic dimension. He transformed Russia from a loose collection of territories into an emerging empire with greater cohesion. The erratic acts that seemed like pure madness were also, in part, a radical if destructive program of reform. Consider Charles VI of France, whose reign was plagued by episodes of disorientation and delusion. During one famous incident, he believed he was made of glass and feared he would shatter if touched. At first glance, this appears to be an absurdity, the mark of a man utterly lost to reason. But Charles ruled during the 100 Years' War, a period of immense strain on the French monarchy. The pressures of constant conflict, dynastic uncertainty, and internal rivalries were staggering. His mental breaks, though tragic, occurred against the backdrop of a fractured kingdom that no ruler could have managed with ease. While his illness was genuine, it was also seized upon by ambitious dukes and relatives who sought to expand their own influence. To call him mad is to tell only half the story. His condition exposed the weakness of a system that relied entirely on the personal stability of one man to hold a kingdom together. What we see as irrationality was inseparable from the structural failings of medieval monarchy itself. In Britain, George III provides another example. His supposed madness has long been the headline of his reign, overshadowing his decades of steady governance. Yet the policies he pursued, even amid his struggles, reflected more than incoherence. He was deeply invested in agriculture, scientific progress, and the moral tone of the monarchy. During the American Revolution, the decisions attributed to his obstinacy or mental decline can also be read as the desperate attempts of a king determined to hold together a global empire at a time when the very notion of colonial independence was new and terrifying to European powers. He clung to the belief that letting the American colonies go would set off a chain reaction that would undo Britain's status as a great power. In hindsight, his refusal to yield seems stubborn to the point of irrationality, but in his context it was a calculated, if rigid, defense of national survival. His breakdowns were real, but they were not the sum of his reign, nor were they the sole reason Britain lost the colonies. The same can be said of Joanna of Castile, whose grief over her husband's death and subsequent confinement have painted her forever as the mad. Yet her story reveals how the label of madness often masked the political agendas of those around her. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles, both benefited from portraying her as unfit. Her refusal to release her husband's body, her erratic displays of devotion, and her withdrawal from public life have been described as signs of insanity. But they also speak to a woman overwhelmed by personal loss and stripped of agency by a world that offered her no outlet for grief or independence. Her so-called madness cleared the way for ambitious men to consolidate power, and in that sense, the label served as a convenient veil for their own maneuvering. When we reframe her story, her erratic acts appear less like lunacy and more like the cries of a woman trapped in a system that denied her humanity. Maria I of Portugal offers another case where the line between personal tragedy and political use of madness blurs. Known as Maria the Mad, she suffered a mental collapse after the deaths of her husband and eldest son, compounded by the weight of ruling a kingdom during turbulent times. To dismiss her as simply insane is to ignore the crushing grief that tore through her life. Her breakdown was genuine, but it also provided the rationale for the establishment of a regency under her son, who became the de facto ruler. Once again, madness became both a medical reality and a political tool, used to shift power in ways that suited others more than the afflicted monarch. The human element at the heart of these stories is impossible to ignore. For all their crowns and palaces, these rulers were still flesh and blood, prone to fear, ambition, grief, and error. Their positions magnified their vulnerabilities. A private sorrow, like the death of a spouse, became a public crisis. A moment of weakness or eccentricity became the seed for stories of madness that would endure for centuries. The very isolation of their roles stripped them of the ordinary supports that most people rely on in times of hardship. Few monarchs could turn to trusted confidants without fear of betrayal. Few could seek rest without appearing negligent. Few could grieve without being branded unfit. In this sense, their madness, real or alleged, was not only about them but also about the inhuman conditions of monarchy itself. The danger of simplistic labels is clear. To call Caligula mad, for instance, is to dismiss the complexity of Roman politics, the hostility of senatorial sources, and the difficulty of ruling an empire defined by constant intrigue. To call Ivan terrible because of his rages is to overlook his role in shaping Russia's identity as a centralized state. To call George III the Mad King who lost America is to ignore decades of reform, stability, and personal devotion to duty. To call Joanna insane is to obscure the political betrayal that left her locked away for most of her life. These labels flatten history into caricature, stripping away nuance and erasing the interplay of personal, political, and cultural forces. By challenging these labels, we begin to see history differently. Erratic acts can be reinterpreted as desperate reforms. Grief-stricken behaviors can be understood as human reactions to loss. Violent outbursts can be seen as both illness and strategy, terrifying but effective in consolidating power. Madness was never just madness. It was also politics, performance, propaganda, and pain. The broader lesson is that monarchy itself created the conditions in which madness flourished as both reality and metaphor. A system that demanded absolute control from one person while surrounding that person with enemies, expectations, and crushing responsibilities was bound to produce cracks. When those cracks appeared, they were given the name madness, and the story was simplified into legend. But behind the legend, the rulers were human beings wrestling with impossible circumstances. When we connect the dots, the image that emerges is not of a gallery of lunatics, but of a series of men and women caught in the contradictions of their roles. Their true agendas, Whether to centralize power, defend their realms, secure alliances, or simply survive, were obscured by the easy shorthand of madness. Their erratic acts often contained a logic invisible to their contemporaries, but discernible in hindsight. Their vulnerabilities remind us that even those who seemed to wield absolute power were often powerless against grief, illness, or betrayal. The next time we encounter a story of a mad monarch, it is worth asking, who called them mad and why? What did that label conceal, and what truths did it erase? By pushing beyond the convenient narratives, we not only reclaim the humanity of these rulers, but also gain a deeper understanding of the fragile and often brutal systems that shaped their lives. To unveil their true agendas is not to excuse their violence or deny their suffering, but to restore the complexity that history deserves. The legacy of monarchs, so often branded as mad, cannot be confined to the familiar caricatures that have dominated history books for centuries. To see them only as tragic figures consumed by instability or as tyrants driven by irrationality is to miss the profound and lasting impact they had on the worlds they ruled. When we reconsider their lives through the lens of strategy, illness, and pressure, their legacies begin to shift. Madness, whether real, feigned, or manufactured by others, shaped not only their reputations, but also the course of nations. In some cases, it hastened collapse or rebellion. In others, it brought about reforms, innovations, or new structures of power that might never have emerged otherwise. These rulers, trapped by their circumstances and yet still agents of change, left behind stories that are far more complex than the myths suggest. Consider again Ivan IV of Russia. His ferocity, once dismissed as the uncontrollable violence of a lunatic, can also be understood as a brutal reordering of Russian society. By crushing the boyars and creating new systems of central authority, he laid the groundwork for the expansion of the Russian state. His methods were terrifying and destructive, but the consequences shaped Russia for centuries. If his madness was both genuine and strategic, then his legacy cannot be measured only in the blood spilled during his reign, but also in the enduring consolidation of Russian power. His example raises an uncomfortable question. Do acts of seeming irrationality sometimes bring about structures of stability? George III, too, offers a case where illness and legacy intertwine. The loss of the American colonies has long overshadowed his reign, yet when we look beyond that narrative, we see a monarch deeply invested in the idea of moral kingship. His personal struggles with illness humanized him to later generations, transforming him from the villain of revolution to the tragic figure of constitutional monarchy. Ironically, his incapacitation during his later years helped strengthen the very system of parliamentary governance that defines Britain today. His madness, though deeply painful, inadvertently accelerated the shift from personal rule to a system where the crown survives more as symbol than sovereign. To reconsider George is to recognize how frailty, rather than strength, reshaped the British monarchy into its modern form. The case of Joanna of Castile demonstrates how labels of madness can erase agency, but also invite reinterpretation. For centuries, she was seen as the madwoman of Tordesillas, a queen whose inability to rule justified her long confinement. Yet re-examinations of her life reveal her as a victim of dynastic politics, her grief weaponized against her by father and son. In understanding her story, we uncover not only the cruelty of a system that silenced women, but also the endurance of a figure who, despite isolation, never entirely disappeared from the political landscape. Joanna's legacy is not simply madness, but the reminder that narratives of insanity often conceal deeper stories of control, manipulation, and survival. Charles VI of France, remembered for believing himself made of glass, lived during one of the most turbulent periods in French history. His mental breaks contributed to the instability of the crown, yet his reign also forced the French nobility and the emerging bureaucracy to adapt to a reality in which royal incapacity was possible. His tragedy revealed the flaws of a system dependent on a single mind to guide a kingdom, and in this way his madness exposed the need for institutional resilience. Though contemporaries saw only chaos, historians can trace from his reign lessons about the vulnerability of absolute monarchy that echoed into the later crises of French history. Maria I of Portugal illustrates how personal grief can become entwined with political legacy. Her collapse, interpreted as madness, shifted governance to her son and reshaped the balance of power in the Portuguese Empire. Her story forces us to see how monarchy could not shield even the most powerful from devastating loss, and how such personal tragedies could redirect the course of nations. To re-evaluate her is to see not simply a mad queen but a mother, a widow, and a ruler caught in the impossible collision of private sorrow and public duty. Even Caligula, whose name has become synonymous with insanity, can be reconsidered. While his excesses and cruelties are undeniable, the stories of his depravity come largely from hostile sources with clear agendas. To the Senate, his attempts to elevate himself as a living god, to break with tradition, and to assert direct power over Rome's institutions seemed the acts of a madman. Yet from another perspective, they were radical experiments in redefining imperial authority. His reign, though short and violent, exposed the deep tension between the emperor and the senatorial elite, a conflict that would shape Roman politics for generations. Madness here may have been less about delusion than about the audacity to challenge entrenched power. When we place all these figures together, their legacies reveal the inadequacy of simplistic labels. Madness, whether feigned, real, or imposed, was never only about personal instability. It was about the way monarchy functioned, the crushing demands it placed on individuals, and the political games played around their lives. To call them mad without qualification is to erase the creativity, ambition, and human suffering that defined their reigns. By reevaluating their impact, we see that their instability often forced adaptation, reform, or rebellion. Their so-called madness shaped history as surely as their policies did. The debate over these monarchs is far from settled. Historical interpretation is never fixed, and as new evidence comes to light, as medical science evolves, and as scholars revisit neglected sources, our understanding shifts. The case of George III demonstrates this well. Once written off as irredeemably insane, he has in recent decades been recast through medical analysis as a man suffering from porphyria or perhaps bipolar disorder. Joanna of Castile, long dismissed as unfit, is now recognized by many historians as more victim than villain. Even Caligula has undergone reassessment, with scholars questioning the reliability of the ancient sources that painted him as a monster. Each new perspective challenges the old narratives, reminding us that history is not a finished story but an ongoing conversation. Modern psychology adds yet another layer to this debate. Conditions that were once seen as curses or madness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression, are now recognized as medical illnesses with complex causes. This shift allows us to view historical rulers not as moral failures or monsters, but as human beings grappling with conditions beyond their control. It also forces us to consider how those conditions interacted with the pressures of monarchy, the expectations of culture, and the ambitions of rivals. Madness becomes not a single explanation, but a web of interlocking forces. What this reveals is that our perception of history is shaped as much by the labels we use as by the facts themselves. To call a monarch mad is to simplify, to flatten, to make the story more digestible. But simplicity is the enemy of truth. The lives of these rulers were complex, their actions often driven by a mix of calculation, desperation, illness, and ambition. By challenging the label of madness, we move closer to a history that respects the humanity of its subjects and acknowledges the messiness of the past. This brings us to the most important point: the responsibility of those who study and remember history. We cannot change the suffering of George III, Joanna of Castile, or Maria I. We cannot undo the bloodshed of Ivan Zapruchnia or the chaos of Charles VI's delusions. But we can change the way we tell their stories. We can refuse to accept convenient myths at face value. We can question the motives of those who branded them insane. We can place their actions in context, seeing not only the madness but also the strategy, the grief, the pressure, and the manipulation that define their lives. And this responsibility does not belong only to scholars. Each of us, when encountering history, has the power to look beyond the surface. The next time you hear a ruler described as mad, ask yourself, who benefits from that story? What pressures might have shaped their behavior? What griefs or illnesses might lie hidden beneath the legend? History comes alive when we challenge the accepted truths, when we refuse to settle for caricature and instead embrace complexity. The tales of the so-called mad monarchs endure not because they are simple, but because they force us to confront the contradictions of power and humanity. They remind us that even those who sat on thrones of gold were vulnerable to illness, grief, and manipulation. They remind us that madness is never a straightforward label, but a mirror reflecting the fears and ambitions of an age. and they remind us that the way we remember the past shapes the way we understand the present. We have peeled back the layers of myth and propaganda. We have looked beyond the asylum walls, the royal Game of Thrones, the crushing weight of the crown, and the hidden agendas behind erratic acts. Now the task is yours. Look again at history's mad monarchs and see not only the madness but also the strategy, the humanity, and the complexity that define them. Refuse the easy stories. Question the old truths. Let their lives challenge you to think differently about power, about perception, and about the fragile line between sanity and madness. Only then can we honor their legacies not as caricatures, but as human beings whose struggles and choices helped shape the world we live in today.